Well, good morning, Shiloh. You know, from cemeteries to churches, people are lighting candles, they're tolling bells, and they're remembering what the writer of Hebrews calls that the great cloud of witnesses who have fought the fight, who have finished their race, and who stand supporting us, those of us who are left here on this earth. Today we are celebrating All Saints Sunday, a day in which we do embrace the pain, embrace the grief, embrace the hope, embrace the life. Today is the day that is not easy. It's not easy for us to remember those we love, those that we adore, those that we admire. It's not easy to face our pain and our grief. In fact, sometimes it's really difficult. It's extra hard on days like today. But death is a part of our lives. It's a part of who we are, and that loss, it changes things. It changes our holidays. It changes our habits. And that loss even changes the way we dream. We hope differently. We live differently. Just the other day, I was filling out some thank you cards. I'm a little behind on all the wonderful things that people have gifted David, food and all kinds of stuff, baby David and our family. And so I've been writing these thank you cards, and I ran across the name of John's grandma and grandpa, Grandma Barb and Poppy. You may recall that just a month ago, he passed away, and there was his name on the list. And when I saw it, I thought to myself, what a difference a month makes. Right? But maybe not just a month, maybe a week or a day. What a difference a moment makes. You are living this way, and then suddenly someone dies, and you start living that way. We live differently. Death changes us. It rocks our lives. Sometimes when we encounter death and pain and grief and sorrow, it pours over us so much so that we can hardly think or move, and at times we can barely breathe. And yet death is inevitable. It's an everyday part of our lives. It's something that we're going to go through. It's like paying taxes. We got to do it, right? I mean, this is what death is to us. And yet sometimes we try to avoid it at all costs. When it comes to death, we don't talk about it. We don't anticipate it. And sometimes some of us are doing everything we can possibly do to cheat it. But here's the thing. My ethics professor, Stanley Hauerwas, used to always say to us while I was in seminary, we aren't going to get out of this life alive, amen? I mean, we're not. It's not going to happen. And yet, we experience such pain and grief and loss. There is a hole in our lives when we experience death. So what do we do? How do we navigate it? How do we navigate that sorrow and that pain so that we can live whole and healthy lives? How do we do that? Well, we do that through the promises of God. So what does God promise us in the midst of pain and suffering? What does God promise us in the middle of our grief? Well, to find that answer, to discover it, we're going to talk about the lives of two women. A woman that's probably middle-aged who's been suffering from a chronic illness. She is dying from it. And a little girl who's on the verge of death has attracted some kind of deadly virus. These women are going to show us the promises of God. And so this morning I want to invite you to open up your Bibles or pull out your sermon notes and turn with me to Mark chapter 5. If you have a Bible from the gathering space, Mark chapter 5 is found on page 702. If you don't have a Bible from the gathering space or you don't have a Bible, take one of these. They're absolutely free. Write your name in it. It's yours. All we ask is that you bring it with you all the time. Why? So that you can be in the Word. So you can familiarize yourself with the Bible. I mean, this is an ancient document, and sometimes it's hard to navigate. And so I just want to encourage you to pick up a Bible. Now, here in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has been traveling back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. At one time, when we first discover him, he's on the Gentile, that is the non-Jewish side of the Sea of Galilee, and he runs across this guy who is demon-possessed. The Bible tells us that he's full of thousands of demons. I mean, this guy is in a really bad place. The whole community has ostracized him. They're absolutely so afraid of him that they chain him up like an animal. And Jesus brings healing to this man's life, and he is freed. And then he goes back across the lake to that little fishing village that we talked about last week called Capernaum. And it's there in Capernaum that he encounters these two women. Now, the first encounter actually isn't with the women, it's with the father of the little girl. His name is Jairus, and Jairus is a leader of the local synagogue. And to be a local synagogue leader means kind of like you're a church trustee. You're in charge of keeping up with the building and opening the doors and making sure everything's kind of organized. Now, that wouldn't have made Jairus wealthy, but it would have given him this incredible reputation in the community. And so here's this guy with an incredible reputation, and he's desperate. Why? Because this little girl is dying. She's on the verge of death. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know where to go, but he's heard this rumor about this healer, this really bizarro healer. And he hears that the healer has come, and so he goes out to meet Jesus by the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. And I can imagine what's going through Jairus' mind. What if he won't talk to me? What if he doesn't do what I ask? What if he won't come back home with me? What if he won't heal my daughter? What if my daughter dies? All of these questions going through Jairus' mind. And with every step that he's walking, I can just imagine the desperation building and building and building. Now, he's well respected. The kind of guy that doesn't let any kind of thing loose, right? Straight and narrow kind of guy. And yet, his daughter is dying, and so he comes to Jesus, and he does the only thing he knows to do. He gets down on his hands and knees, this respected member of the community, and he begs Jesus to heal his daughter. Church, have you ever been in a place of utter desperation? I mean, absolutely with nothing to lose, right? No, not your dignity, nothing to lose. And so all you do is cry out to God, and you beg God. You beg God for a healing. You beg God to find something. You beg God to change you. You beg God because you are desperate. Well, that's where Jairus is. He's desperate. And so Jesus promises to go with him to his home to heal this little girl. But then along the way, we got to pay attention when stuff happens along the way. So often we are focused on getting to our destination that we don't realize that God does so many miracles along the way. As Jesus and Jairus are traveling back to Jairus' house, the crowd is growing larger and larger and larger, and it's there along the way that the stories of these two women collide. It's there along the way that we see God's promises revealed. Let's take a look at Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 28. The Bible tells us this. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Two women plagued by death. The first, a 12-year-old girl, and the second, a woman who's been dying from the inside out for 12 years. And they're desperate. They're desperate for the touch of Jesus. They're desperate for something to happen in their lives. They're desperate. Church, isn't this our story? Isn't this our story? Aren't we desperate for the touch of God? For God to change things, for God to heal us, for God to bring an end to our pain and our suffering. We're desperate. So how in the midst of all this pain and suffering, this grief and sorrow, can God heal us from the inside out? Well, through his promises. Jesus' promise is a promise of healing. It's a promise of healing. It's one thing to be sick, to have a cold, to catch a virus. It's one thing to have the flu. I mean, no one wants the flu. I mean, it's flu shot season. Nobody wants to be recovering from the flu. And yet, here's this woman suffering from a chronic illness. Sick so long she doesn't even know what it's like to be made well, right? I mean, she's been sick year after year after year, sick so long that she doesn't even know what wholeness or health even looks like. Let me tell you, when people have chronic illnesses, it's a whole bag of frustration and anger and depression and long-suffering that they never anticipated ever having. Mark tells us that this woman has been bleeding for 12 years, and because of that blood, she is unclean. That means no one, absolutely no one can touch her. Not her family, not her neighbors, not even her best friend can give her a hug. She is unclean and no one can touch her. That means no matter how many times she goes to the priest, and let me tell you, she goes. And he says to her, go and wash in the water, and she washes in the water, and she washes in the water, and she prays, and she washes in the water, and still, she's sick. She's bleeding. She's unclean. Just like Jairus, you can sense this woman's desperation. And she hears this rumor about this healer. And she does the only thing that she knows to do. She goes to see that healer. But you got to understand, this woman is so full of shame and pain. It's dangerous for her to even be in the crowd. You see, every person that she brushes up against is made unclean by her very presence in the crowd. The Bible tells us that the crowd is growing larger and larger and larger, and she's getting further and further away from Jesus. And she decides, she's playing the scenarios through her mind. How can I touch him? How can I get to the healer? And she decides she won't confront him. Remember all that shame? She's not going to go face to face with him. She's not even going to touch his skin. She decides that if she will just reach out and touch the hem of his cloak, then she'll be healed. And so I can just picture her elbowing her way through the crowd, desperate, kind of like a pickpocket narrowing in on his or her target. She just goes through that crowd and she reaches out and she touches Jesus. And this is what happens. Take a look at Mark chapter 5, verses 29 through 31. The Bible tells us immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And at once Jesus realized that the power had gone out from him, and he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" You see, the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you asked, "Who touched me?" Now, church, you got to love the disciples. They're clueless. They never get it. They never really understand what's going on. And so in the middle of all that mess, they look at Jesus and they said, "You got to be kidding me, Jesus. There are hundreds of people gathered here. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But what they didn't know was there was a woman suffering from a chronic disease for 12 years, and she believed that if she just touched the hem of his garment, she'd be healed. And she was healed. And then Jesus says, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And the woman is thinking to herself, "Oh no, I've been found out." And so she is filled with this fear. And she thinks to herself, "I'll just be quiet. I won't say anything." But Jesus is relentless. He keeps saying, "Who touched me? Who touched me?" And I can imagine all this stuff going through her mind, like, what if he calls me out? What if he's like everybody else? What if he ostracizes me? What if he outs me? What if he takes the healing back? What then? And finally, she just allows those fears to go away. And she says, "I touched you. I touched you." She, like Jairus, gets down on her hands and knees and begs before Jesus and says, "I touched you." And then Jesus leans down and says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Now, why does he call her daughter? Jesus calls this woman daughter because he's claiming her as her own, as his own. She is his daughter. Do you realize that Jesus claims every single person who suffers as his own? She's been dead. She was dead to her community, dead to her family. She was dead to the entire Jewish world. She was dead, unclean, ostracized, no longer a part of her world. And yet, Jesus reached out and he touched her. And that touch brought a healing that changed everything. Church, the healing touch of Jesus Christ changes everything. When Jesus touches us, we experience a healing like we've never experienced before. Sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's spiritual, sometimes it's emotional. But every time Jesus touches us, it changes things. It changes us. And it has the power to change the world. You may not realize it, but that word healing is the same word for salvation, sozo. It means that when Jesus comes to heal us, he just doesn't want to heal a little bit of us. He wants to heal all of us. Our whole bodies, minds, souls, and spirit. That healing is all of it. And so when we have an encounter just like this woman with Jesus, he comes to heal it all. Well, Jesus is there along the street, healing this woman, and something happens. People come to Jairus and they tell Jairus, your daughter has died. She's dead. His 12-year-old little girl is dead. And Jairus has a choice. Jesus looks right at Jairus, right in the face, and he says, don't be afraid. Just believe. Don't be afraid. Just believe. And so Jesus dismisses the crowd, and he takes Peter and James and John, and they go with Jairus to his house. And when they get there, all these people are wailing and crying and absolutely in utter pain and sorrow. I mean, they've lost this little girl. They've lost a dream. And all the what ifs are running through their mind and their bodies. All those things that would never happen. No graduation. No first day of college. No walking her down the aisle. They're so full of pain and suffering. And then this stranger walks into their house. And this is what he says. Jesus says, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. I mean, can you imagine? The stranger walks into your house and says, oh, stop crying. The child's just asleep. They've been thinking to themselves, you got to be kidding me. I don't know who you are, but I've been here. I've watched this girl take labored breath after labored breath. I've been here. I've watched her through the night as the life just slipped through her body. I've been here. I don't know who you are, but I've been here, and this girl is dead. And so what do? They laugh. They laugh. Now, this isn't the first time anybody's laughed at God. Our forefather and foremother in the faith, Abraham and Sarah, they laughed at God. Sometimes we laugh at God. And so these people, they laughed. And then Jesus clears the room. And he takes with him those 3 disciples and the mom and the dad. And the mom, the one with the bloodshot eyes who's been crying through the night. The mom who's not slept a wink for the last few days, that mom is standing there beside the lifeless body of her daughter. And you got to realize this is the first time that Jairus has even seen his daughter. And I can imagine it's just all that he can do to contain himself. I mean, there is his lifeless daughter. And if you've ever seen someone who has died, when they die, when they take that last breath, their bodies turn blue and ashy and gray. In that one moment, life just slips right out of their body. And so I can imagine that when he sees his daughter like that, it's all he can do to contain himself. And then there are the disciples. You know, they've got to be so awkward. They don't know what to say. And they're just watching Jesus' every move. And then he does it. He touches her. The healing touch of Jesus Christ. He touches her. But this time, the touch is not just a touch of healing. This time, the touch is a touch of resurrection. And Jesus leans down and he grabs that little girl's hand and he whispers into her ear, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Get up. Church, the touch of Jesus is not just a touch of healing, it's a touch of resurrection. Just like that little girl, we too are in the midst of death. Sometimes it's the death of a dream, other times it's the death of a career, at times it's the death of a relationship, and all the time we are suffering from the death of someone we love. We experience death. And just like that little girl, Jesus is holding our hand and he's whispering into our ear, get up. Church, get up and live. In Jesus, we have this hope that this life isn't all there is, this hope that death is not the end, this hope that we can have life, that we can get up in Jesus Christ. With Jesus, there is hope. So often we get so bogged down with that overwhelming feeling of pain and sorrow and of grief, so bogged down in our suffering that we can feel like there is no hope. But there is. There's hope. You know, every single day, I pray with my kids on the way to school. And every day for a month, Topher has been praying for Poppy. Now, the theologian in me wants to correct Topher and say, no, Topher, Poppy's dead. We're not supposed to pray for him. He's dead. And yet, there'll be moments when he'll say, you know, God, in his 5-year-old little voice, ask Poppy if he's enjoying himself in heaven. Ask him if he's having fun. And then I think to myself, oh my gosh, my 5-year-old gets it. The veil between life and death is so very thin. That even though death surrounds us, it's an ever-present reality. We can't get away from it. It's like taxes. It's going to happen. We're not getting out of this life alive. Even though death is a reality, in the middle of that prayer, I recognize that God is present. And there is hope. There is resurrection. You realize Jesus came and he grieved our grief. He lived our lives. He died our death. He was resurrected so that we could experience the power of resurrection. Every single moment of our lives, Jesus is holding our hand and he's whispering into our ears, church, get up. Get up.